There is a stretch of water between the coast of Norway and the coast of Newfoundland that sailors spent 1,000 years learning to fear. In the year 982, that water killed almost everything that entered it. Waves in the open North Atlantic can run higher than a mast. The fog banks off Greenland swallow whole horizons for days at a time. There is no shelter, no landmark, and for most of the crossing, no bottom that any anchor will ever reach. The Roman Empire, with all its engineering, never seriously attempted it. The great Mediterranean shipbuilding traditions, with their heavy hulls and thick frames, stayed home. And yet in that same year, 982, a farmer recently convicted of killing his neighbors loaded an open wooden boat with livestock, family, and followers, and sailed west out of Iceland into the worst ocean in the northern hemisphere. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson. History remembers him as Erik the Red. He was not sailing a warship. He was not sailing anything a modern eye would call ocean-worthy. He was sailing an open vessel with a single wool sail, planks thin enough to flex in your hands, and no deck to keep the sea out. By every intuition we have about ships, it should have been a coffin. Instead, boats built this way crossed to Greenland and then went further, all the way to North America, roughly 500 years before Columbus. So the question this episode answers is a precise one. Not whether the Norse crossed the Atlantic. We know they did, and near the end of this video, I will show you the field in Newfoundland that proves it. The question is how? How did a shallow, open, flexible boat survive an ocean that sank bigger, heavier, stronger ships for centuries afterward? The answer is not courage. The answer is engineering, and one piece of it involves a crystal that could find the sun through solid cloud. Hold on to that. We will come back to it. Here is exactly where this investigation goes. First, the hull itself, and the single counterintuitive design decision that made a thin-planked open boat safer in a storm than a rigid one. A principle modern naval architects fully understand. Second, the sail, a piece of woolen technology that by some estimates demanded more labor than the wooden hull it powered, and without which none of this happens. Third, navigation, how Norse crews held a course across open water with no magnetic compass, using memorized sailing directions that modern climatologists have actually tested, plus the disputed sunstone. Fourth, the military dimension, because these ships were not just transport, they were a logistics weapon that let small forces appear where no army could be waiting. And fifth, the proof, a Norse settlement on the coast of Newfoundland, scientifically confirmed, sitting there in the grass roughly 1,000 years after it was built. One note before we begin. Everything in this episode rests on published archaeology, experimental reconstruction, and the physical ships themselves, several of which survive nearly intact and can be visited today. Where the evidence is argued, I will tell you it is argued. Start with the man, because his voyage frames everything. Erik the Red did not leave Iceland as an explorer. He left as an exile, sentenced to 3 years of outlawry after a feud that ended in killings, which meant that for that fixed term, any man could kill him without legal consequence, and he could not legally remain. Most men in his position would have waited it out quietly on some remote farm. Erik instead pointed his ship at a rumor, a coastline that sailors blown off course had glimpsed somewhere in the west, roughly 450 nautical miles of open water away, and committed himself to it. What he found was the largest island on Earth. He spent his 3 years of exile probing its southwestern fjords, wintering there, marking out farm sites, and when his sentence ended, he returned to Iceland with a sales pitch. He called the place Greenland, by most accounts quite deliberately, because a good name would draw settlers, and Iceland at that moment was land-hungry, its best valleys already claimed by a century of settlement. It worked. Around the year 985 or 986, a colonization fleet followed him west, and the saga tradition preserves the numbers with brutal honesty. 25 ships set out from Iceland. 14 arrived. The rest turned back or were simply never seen again. Nearly half a fleet, gone or defeated, on a single crossing. The Greenland run was a filter, and it filtered ruthlessly. Yet here's the detail that turns this from an adventure story into an engineering question. Enough ships made it, again and again, season after season, that the Norse built a functioning colonial society on Greenland. 2 clusters of farms known as the Eastern and Western settlements, home at their peak to somewhere in the low thousands of people. A society that traded walrus ivory and furs back to Europe, imported iron and timber and grain, raised churches, and endured for more than 4 centuries. Ships did not just survive this route once, on a lucky day with a kind sea. They ran it as infrastructure, a scheduled artery of a functioning economy. And in that same colonization year, 986, A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to join his father in the new colony, was blown off course in fog and sighted a low, forested coastline that was obviously not Greenland. He did not land. But his report circulated, and around the year 1000, Erik's own son, Leif Erikson, bought Bjarni's ship, retraced the sighting, and made landfall in North America. So the crossing was repeatable, and it was extendable, which means the survival was not luck. Something about these boats was systematically better suited to that ocean than anything else afloat in the medieval world. To see what, we have to look at an actual ship. We can, because one survives. In 1880, excavators opened a large burial mound at Gokstad Farm in Vestfold, Norway, and found a 9th century vessel interred inside it, buried around the year 900 as the tomb of a chieftain, preserved by the airtight blue clay of the mound. It is the ship we now call the Gokstad ship, today the largest vessel in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, a little over 23 meters long and about 5.2 meters across the beam, built almost entirely of oak, with 16 rows of planking aside. Stand under its hull, and the first thing that strikes you is how little wood there is. The planking is thin, alarmingly thin. Most of it is barely an inch thick, some of it less. This is not the massive timber of later European ocean ships, and that thinness is not a compromise. It is the entire point. Norse builders worked in a method called clinker construction. Instead of fitting planks edge to edge against a heavy pre-built skeleton, they built the shell first, overlapping each plank over the one below it like the boards of a fence laid sideways, and riveting the overlaps together with iron. Thousands of rivets in a single hull, each one hammered over a small square washer called a rove. The seams were caulked with tarred animal hair, wool, and moss, packed into the overlaps so the joints could move and still keep the water out. The internal frames went in afterward, shaped to fit a hull that already existed, and critically, in the classic Norse method, the lower planking was attached to those frames not with rigid fastenings, but with flexible lashings. Cords passed through cleats left standing proud on the inner face of the planks when they were shaped. The planks themselves were split from the oak radially, wedged apart along the grain like slicing a cake, rather than sawn across it, which kept the wood's natural fibers continuous from end to end, and made a thin plank far stronger and springier than its size suggests. A sawn plank cuts across the grain and severs those fibers. A split plank keeps them, which is why a Viking strake an inch thick could do work that would crack a sawn board twice as heavy. Now put that hull in a storm, and here is the reveal. The ship bends. In heavy seas, a Viking hull visibly flexes, twisting and working with the shape of each wave, the way a snake moves over uneven ground. We do not have to take that on faith because in 1893, a Norwegian captain named Magnus Andersen built an exact replica of the Gokstad ship, named it the Viking, and sailed it from Bergen across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland in 27 days, on his way to the Chicago World's Fair, deliberately timed to upstage the Columbus anniversary. Andersen kept a log, and his observations are the single best field report on Viking naval architecture ever written. He recorded the bottom of the hull flexing up and down by as much as 2 centimeters in heavy seas, the gunwale twisting out of true by around 15 centimeters, the whole ship visibly working, and yet the hull stayed tight, took on almost no water, and at times ran at 10 and even 11 knots, a speed many 19th century sailing vessels of far greater size could not match. To a landsman, that flexing looks like the ship coming apart. It is the opposite. A rigid hull meeting a large wave takes the entire load at once, and the stress concentrates at the stiffest points until something cracks. A flexing hull spreads that same load across the whole structure, absorbing energy through movement instead of resisting it through mass. Modern engineers design aircraft wings on exactly this principle. Watch a wingtip flex in turbulence. That flex is why it does not snap. And on a Boeing 787, the wingtips are certified to flex upward by several meters before failure. The Norse arrived at the same answer with an axe and an eye, and it gave them a second compounding advantage. Because the hull needed so little wood, the ship was astonishingly light for its size. A hull the size of Gokstad's weighing on the order of 7 or 8 tons empty, where a rigid ship of equal length could weigh several times that. Light meant it rode over waves rather than punching through them, shipped less water in a sea that would swamp a heavier boat, drew so little that it floated in water barely a meter deep, and could be run straight up onto a beach and dragged ashore by its own crew. And beneath it all ran a keel cut from a single great oak timber nearly 18 meters long, subtly deepened in the middle, the spine that took the grounding loads and gave the ship grip against sideways drift, and let everything above it move. Strength through stiffness is one philosophy of the sea. The Norse bet on strength through flexibility, and on the North Atlantic their bet paid and everyone else is drowned. But a hull, even a brilliant one, is only a raft without an engine, and the engine of a Viking ship was wool. This is one of the least appreciated facts in the entire story. A 2015 study in Northern Archaeological Textiles examined what actually goes into a Viking sail, and the answer reframes the whole enterprise. The sail was woven from wool, and not just any wool, but fleece from primitive Northern European sheep breeds, whose coats carry 2 layers, long, coarse outer hairs that shed water, and naturally greasy inner wool that swells when damp and seals the weave. The wool was sorted by hand, spun by hand on a drop spindle, thread by thread, then woven on upright warp-weighted looms, then finished and smeared with a treatment of fat, tar, and ochre, so that the cloth would hold an airfoil shape and drive against the wind rather than simply bagging out like a bedsheet. Follow the labor chain backward and the numbers become staggering. A large ocean sail could run to 90 or 100 square meters. Experimental reconstructions, most famously the work done for Norwegian sail replicas by researchers like Amy Lightfoot, suggest that producing a single large sail from raw fleece could consume years of skilled labor and the annual wool of hundreds of sheep, spinning alone accounting for thousands of hours, which is why several scholars now argue that the sail may represent as much accumulated work as the wooden hull beneath it, possibly more. A hull could be built by a small team in a season. The sail was a multi-year community project, which tells you something important about who built Viking sea power, because in Norse society, textile production was women's work. Every ocean crossing was propelled by the accumulated winter labor of Norse households, and overwhelmingly by the hands of women, generations of them, spinning through the dark months. Woolen cloth was so central to this economy that in Iceland, standardized homespun cloth, called vodmal, functioned as legal currency, with prices and fines set in ells of it. The sail was the second half of the machine, and no raid, no trade route, and no Atlantic colony moves an inch without it. Then comes the problem that should have stopped everything. The problem that stopped the Romans and nearly everyone else. Navigation. Open the crossing from Norway to Iceland to Greenland on a map, and you are looking at days, sometimes weeks, out of sight of land, with no magnetic compass, no charts, and no instruments in the modern sense. The Norse even had a word for the failure state, hafvila, the condition of being lost at sea with all bearings gone, and the sagas use it the way pilots use the word stall. How do you hold a course? Part of the answer is doctrine. Memorize sailing directions passed from pilot to pilot, and remarkably, we can test them because some survive in Old Norse texts. The medieval Icelandic manuscript known as Hauksbok preserves the actual route brief for the Greenland run, and it reads like an operations order. Sail from Hernar in Norway due west toward Greenland. Pass north of Shetland, close enough that you can just see it in clear weather. Pass south of the Faroes, so that the sea stands halfway up the mountain slopes. Pass south of Iceland, close enough to meet its birds and its whales. Every clause in that sentence is a position fix without an instrument. Distance judged by how much of a known island stands above the horizon. Position confirmed by the seabirds that never range far from land, and the whale feeding grounds that sit over known banks. A 2002 study in the Journal of Navigation analyzed those Old Norse sailing directions for the North Atlantic routes against modern climatological data, treating them not as folklore, but as operational instructions. And the picture that emerges is of a genuinely practical system. Courses set by latitude, holding a steady east-west line by keeping the sun and stars at known heights above the horizon, timed to the seasonal windows when winds and daylight favored the run. Sail west and hold your latitude, and Greenland is simply too long a coastline to miss. A 2024 study in the Journal of the North Atlantic examined Norse navigation in the Northern Isles and found the same character of knowledge closer to shore, sea marks, tides, and bearings held in memory as a professional inheritance, passed down as a craft. The navigator was a database. And there may have been an instrument after all. In 1948, a Danish archaeologist excavating a Norse site at Unartok in Greenland found half of a small notched wooden disc, and scholars, beginning with Carl Solver, argued it was a bearing dial, a sun compass whose central pin cast a shadow across scribed curves that showed direction at that latitude and season. That interpretation is still debated. Other researchers read the object differently, but the geometry works, and reconstructed dials have been tested at sea. Which brings us back to the crystal I promised you at the start. The sagas mention something called a sunstone, used to find the sun when it could not be seen. For a long time, this was dismissed as legend. It is not being dismissed anymore. Research on light polarization has shown the physical basis. Skylight is polarized in a pattern centered on the sun, and certain natural crystals, notably Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite, split light into two beams whose relative brightness changes as you rotate the stone, revealing that polarization pattern. In practical terms, on a fully overcast day, a trained user sighting patches of sky through the crystal can work out where the sun is behind the cloud. And experiments led by the physicist Guy Ropars at Rennes showed the method can locate the hidden sun to within about a degree. Researchers Gabor Horvath and Suzanne Akison spent years testing polarization navigation under real Arctic skies, and a follow-on simulation study published by the Royal Society ran thousands of virtual Bergen to Greenland voyages, finding that a crew checking a sunstone every few hours would make landfall on the Greenland coast, with success rates above 90% even in poor weather. There is even a tantalizing physical hint: a block of Iceland spar recovered from an Elizabethan wreck off Alderney, found lying near the ship's navigation instruments, centuries after the Viking Age, but suggesting the technique lived on quietly among practical seamen. A 2021 analysis published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science weighed the case that such a crystal really was the Viking sunstone, and while no stone has yet been recovered from a Norse wreck with a label on it, the method demonstrably works. Put the pieces together, memorized latitude sailing tested against real climate data, bird and whale and horizon fixes from a written route brief, possible bearing dials, and a polarization trick for sunless days, and you no longer have sailors gambling on the horizon. You have a navigation system. Now, the part that ties this to everything else this channel covers, because a ship that can cross the Atlantic can do something far more immediately profitable closer to home. It can win wars without fighting battles. Think about what this vessel actually is in military terms. It is fast under sail, capable of bursts above 10 knots, and independent of wind under oars, with 30 or more rowers who are also the assault force. It draws so little water, often less than a meter, that it can leave the open sea and proceed up a river that no other warship can enter, which is how Norse fleets appeared under the walls of Paris in 885, having simply sailed up the Seine, and why the raiding range of these ships extended hundreds of kilometers inland from any coast. It needs no harbor, no pier, no infrastructure at all. A gravel beach is a port. And it is light enough that its own crew can haul it ashore, or even carry it overland between waterways, which is exactly how Scandinavian crews crossed the portages between the rivers of Eastern Europe and reached the Black Sea and the Caspian, a traffic recorded in the hundreds of thousands of Arab silver dirhams that have been dug out of Scandinavian soil. A force equipped with these ships holds an advantage that has nothing to do with swords. It chooses the time and place of every engagement. The raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 announced the doctrine, and coastal and river settlements across 9th and 10th century Europe learned it the hard way for 2 centuries afterward. Defenders had to be strong everywhere along hundreds of miles of coast and river. The raiders only had to be strong at one point, for one morning. The economics tell you who was winning. After the Battle of Malden in 991, the English crown paid 10,000 pounds of silver simply to make a fleet go away, and the payments escalated over the following decades to sums measured in tens of thousands of pounds. A tax on an entire kingdom levied by the existence of a hull design. That is not piracy as an incident, that is a logistics system imposing itself on a continent, and the ship is the entire system. The archaeology backs the breadth of it. In 1962, archaeologists raised 5 Viking ships that had been deliberately scuttled to block a channel at Skoldelev in Roskilde Fjord, Denmark, and among them was a 30-meter longship whose timber analysis showed it had been built of Irish oak near Dublin around 1042, physical proof of a shipbuilding network spanning the whole Norse world. Then a 1999 report in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology described how expansion work at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde uncovered 9 more early ships in the ground beneath the harbor, including the longest Viking ship ever found, some 37 meters of warship. And the Norse fleet revealed by finds like these is not one design, but a family. Long, slender troop carriers built for speed and rivers at one end, and at the other, broader, deeper-bellied cargo vessels, the type the Norse called the nar, shorter, wider, higher-sided, sailed by crews of just a handful, built to haul livestock, timber, and settlers across open ocean. The same report noted the museum's advancing plans for experimental ocean sailing and reconstructed vessels, and that experimental tradition is a large part of how we know all of this works, because it has been tested at full scale. The museum's reconstruction of the Dublin-built longship, the Sea Stallion, sailed from Roskilde around Scotland to Dublin in 2007 with a crew of 60, and a replica Nar named Saga Siglar did not merely cross the Atlantic, it sailed around the world. The raiding ship and the Atlantic ship are siblings. The same shipyard logic that emptied monasteries also settled Greenland. So walk the ladder of what this technology made possible, rung by rung, because the Atlantic was not crossed in one leap. It was taken the way a methodical army takes ground. The first rung was the Northern Isles, Shetland and Orkney, roughly a day's sail from Norway with a fair wind, close enough to be a training ground for open water passage, and the navigation studied in that 2024 Journal of the North Atlantic Research shows how thoroughly the Norse made those waters their own, until the islands were not a destination, but a waypoint. The second rung was the Faroe Islands, a harder jump, real open ocean with a small target at the end of it, exactly the kind of run where latitude sailing proves itself, because miss the Faroes by a few dozen miles and there is nothing behind them but water. The third rung was Iceland, a major oceanic crossing to an empty volcanic island, and the settlement tradition even preserves the reconnaissance methods. One early voyager, Floki Vilgerdarson, is said to have carried ravens aboard and released them, following the bird that flew toward unseen land. Iceland the Norse did not merely visit, but colonize wholesale from the 870s onward, the settlement book listing hundreds of named founding households, building a society of farms and laws that by 930 had a national assembly, the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments on earth. The historian Alexander Sandmark, in the 2017 study Viking Law and Order, traces this expansion across Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland, not as a scattering of adventurers, but as a transplanted legal and social order. Whole communities moving across an ocean and reassembling themselves, courts and assemblies and property law on the far side. The fourth rung was Greenland itself, Erik's rung, the crossing that filtered fleets, and even there, the Norse did not just cling on. A study in the collection, Studies in the Medieval Atlantic, examined what the Greenland Norse actually knew about their environment, the ice, the currents, the seasonal windows for the crossing and for the long hunting voyages north to the walrus grounds. And the depth of that knowledge is the quiet answer to the whole puzzle. Because it means every crossing fed information back into the system. Routes were learned, refined, taught. The ocean was being mapped in memory. And the fifth rung was the one nobody else on Earth would reach for another 5 centuries. North America. Which brings us to the proof I promised, because extraordinary claims need more than sagas. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, there is a place called L'Anse aux Meadows. In 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, following the saga descriptions along the coast, were shown a group of grassy mounds by a local fisherman named George Decker, mounds the villagers had always called the Old Indian Camp. The excavations Anne Stein led over the following years uncovered the remains of 8 timber-framed turf buildings of unmistakably Norse type, the same construction the Norse used in Iceland and Greenland, dating to roughly 1,000 years ago. This was not wishful reading of ambiguous stones. The site produced Norse artifacts and Norse architecture on the North American side of the Atlantic, a bronze ring-headed cloak pin of Norse style, a soapstone spindle whorl that tells you women were present in spinning, and, most tellingly, a smithy with a furnace, iron slag, and boat rivets, evidence that crews were repairing clinker-built ships there, using iron smelted on site, the first ironworking in the Americas. The site even yielded butternuts, a species that does not grow that far north, meaning these crews had traveled further south along the coast and come back. And the scientific verification went deeper than the buildings. A 1975 paleoecological investigation of the settlement site studied the layers of soil and plant material around the structures, the environmental fingerprint of the occupation itself, adding an independent line of evidence to the archaeology. Then, in 2021, a study in the journal Nature closed the case with almost absurd precision. Researchers Margot Quidams and Michael D. examined wood from the site that had been cut with metal tools the indigenous population did not possess, and found in its tree rings the radiocarbon signature of a known cosmic ray event from the year 993. Counting the rings outward from that marker to the bark gave the exact year the trees were felled by Norse blades, 1021. Not a range, a year. L'Anse aux Meadows is today accepted as a genuine Norse settlement in North America, and in 1978 it became one of the very first cultural sites ever inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Stand in that grassy field, and every thread of this episode converges under your feet. The flexing clinker hull got them there. The wool sail drove them there. The latitude doctrine and perhaps the sunstone steered them there. A boat with no deck, no compass, and no engine connected Norway to Newfoundland 1,000 years ago, and the connection is physically in the ground. Step back then and name what actually happened, because the lesson is bigger than the Vikings. The North Atlantic did not become gentler in the 10th century. The same waves that swallowed heavier, stiffer, more impressive-looking ships were running the whole time, and they kept running afterward, sinking stout European vessels for centuries on routes the Nar had flown across. What changed was the design philosophy sailing into them. Nearly everyone else built ships the intuitive way, stronger, heavier, more rigid, meet force with force. The Norse built the opposite, thin, light, and flexible, a hull that surrendered its shape to the wave for a moment and got it back. A sail assembled from a community's worth of patient labor, and a navigation system that lived in trained minds rather than on paper. Intuition says the strongest ship survives the storm. The record in the water says otherwise, and so does Magnus Anderson's log from 1893, written aboard a faithful copy as it flexed and ran and stayed dry all the way to Newfoundland. The ship that survived was the one designed to bend. That is why a convicted killer in an open boat could found a colony on Greenland, why small crews could hold the coasts of Europe hostage for 2 centuries and tax kingdoms without conquering them, and why there are Norse building foundations in Canada, now dated to the precise year 1021, that predate Columbus by roughly 500 years. The ocean sank everyone else. It could not sink a ship that refused to fight it. If this changed how you think about what a so-called primitive boat can do, subscribe to the War Room Files, because next time we are staying with engineering that decided wars, and if the episode earned it, a like genuinely helps this kind of long-form history find the people who want it. Thank you for watching.